Dear guests, dear organizers, ladies and gentlemen. Sándor Márai, citizen of Košice, and János Eszterházy was two prominent Hungarians who lived in the same land as I do. I am a Hungarian of Upper Hungary, and I share the next idea that we are in this world for us to be home somewhere. I was born in the Upper Hungarian area, which is now part of Slovakia, but I remain Hungarian. So our birth and our descendants defines who we are. So I am a minority from two different aspects. I was born in Czechoslovakia as a Hungarian, and as opposed to some other Hungarians living there in the city of Levice, I have always been living in a minority. But this is not a curse, this is a blessing. That's how I experienced it. It made me stronger. Already as a student, I already discovered those three values Europe is built on and which the old continent must never forget. So these three values, these three ideas are the central ideas of my presentation. With this, Europe can prevail, but without it, it will be an unimportant gray area. And having these values will be enriching. These three values are Christian democracy, regionalism, and the protection of minorities. So let's go backwards and let's start with the protection of minorities. Out of the 9 primary schools in Levice, the only one that teaches in Hungarian is where I studied, so I could learn in my mother tongue. If I didn't have that, I would be a different person today because I should have learned in another language. So I am grateful that I could learn in my mother tongue, but it should be a fundamental right to everyone. Because what kind of a Europe is it that doesn't encourage the enrichment of every cultural community? That would be a weak Europe. The president of the Hungarian parliament, László, said the following when he was in Slovakia unveiling a Hungarian memorial. He said the right to national culture should be a fundamental right and it should be recognized as a basic human right. I absolutely agree with this idea because we cannot just rely on the mercy of the member states. We have to ensure these rights for everybody. I know that there are some good examples, and of course every country is different, so I'm just talking about the principle now. Ladies and gentlemen, there are over 50 million citizens in the EU who belong to some kind of minority. That is 1 out of 7 people. And they live in a minority due to peace pacts that were based on political reasons or based on petty revenge and did not take into account the regional features. It is a shame that in January this year the Minority Safe Pact was rejected by the European Commission. And it would be a huge responsibility to protect the rights of the minorities. So basically, by rejecting it, the European Commission just ignored the will of over 1 million European citizens. Let me also share a personal example. My little daughter was born in Komárno in Slovakia, which is just across the Hungarian border. But as she is born, she is the descendant of war criminals, because our ancestors were considered war criminals in Czechoslovakia. But I imagine a future Europe which will not accept it that newborns can be treated as descendants of war criminals. If it doesn't happen, then everybody will lose in the future. I understand that the Beneš decretums were necessary for Czechoslovakia at the end of the Second World War. But first of all, we no longer have Czechoslovakia, and second of all, the Second World War ended nearly 80 years ago. And thirdly, these decretums, these laws, which claimed the common responsibility of 13 minorities living in Czechoslovakia, these are obsolete. So getting rid of them, apologizing, and rehabilitation of the victims would be inevitable. Such judgments or such condemnations cannot happen in the future Europe. To be European means that we take responsibility for our mistakes, and we not only focus on short-term profits, but we aim to make decisions that will guarantee long-term sustainable peace. And one of the most important areas to ensure the long-term peace is the protection of the rights of minorities. So that's why I consider this one of the most important pillars for the future of Europe. The next one is regionalism. In my birth town, I very quickly recognized the value of multiculturalism. I will never be Slovakian, and my Slovakian friends will never be Hungarians, but we can both be patriots of the same city. And on this recognition, we can build a European politics. I'm not saying with this that national identity is not necessary, because nothing can replace national identity. What I'm saying, though, is that regional features can also be important factors in the national identity. And these national identities can exist within a state, but they can also exist cross-border, and they can connect regions. Now, remaining with the local examples, somebody who lives in a small town in Slovakia belongs to a county in Slovakia where another person, like this person is from Hungarian origin, but another person comes from a Slovakian origin, yet they have to follow the same laws and the same rules. And it is therefore the task of the state to have such laws that will represent all the local residents' interests. Let's just take another example. The upper and lower Bodroköz regions of Slovakia. Hopefully, if we ensure the regional features to prevail in these areas, the people will have a better understanding with each other, and they can also have more beneficial cooperations across the borders too. As far as the international regions are concerned, the Visegrad cooperation is now very thriving, and Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is trying to fill it with new modern ideas. Now, it's not the old Frank empires or the Roman Empire, but it is the local nations that are trying to reshape a new Europe. and new cooperations. And it's not only due to my identity that I'm hopeful for this kind of cooperations, but because as a Hungarian living in Slovakia, the former Upper Hungary region, we can only hope that these cooperations will thrive. We are in the center of this cooperation, and we are the ones who can speak the languages of these cooperations, and we can absolutely work together on making sure that this cooperation will play an important role in the region. Another political thinker, Miklós Durai, said the same thing in 1991, 30 years ago. We know three different forms of international cooperation: the Europe of states, the Europe of nations, and the Europe of regions. The Europe of states is a federation or confederation of states, but it is feared that it can become a supranational institution. The Europe of nations is based on forming national cooperations, but instead of saying the Europe of nations, we should rather say the Europe of nation states, because there can be both positive and negative examples from our history about the cooperation of nations. So the Europe of nations should replace the Europe of states, where the Europe of states is doomed to fail, like in Central Eastern Europe. And there can be a lot of tensions due to history in these parts of Europe. So hopefully the Europe of nations can be the solution in the future, because it's outside of separatism, irredentism, and other ideologies. We can form a regional cooperation which will not bring about the reshaping of borders. So despite of the currently existing borders, it can reconnect the neighboring regions with each other. And from this, I'd like to move on to the third pillar, which is the most important one. It's Christian democracy. According to József Antal, in Europe, even an atheist is a Christian, because on a continent where Sunday is the day of rest, where even those who don't believe in Christ count the time from the birth of Christ, where in case of an accident everybody says Jesus Christ, we don't need to explain who we are and what holds us together. We are united in the Christian culture by maintaining our differences at the same time. We also consider as brethren, as brothers and sisters, the other denominations like Orthodox churches, but everything that denies Christianity is outside of our cultural circles. And the equality of people, subsidiarity, acceptance of each other, the idea of universality, aiming at social justice, they all derive from Christianity. In the first half of the last century, we could see what happens if foreign ideologies will prevail over Christianity. So we should not we shouldn't even consider an idea of Europe without Christianity. It's not plausible, and we couldn't even call it Europe. Following the Second World War, the cooperation in Western Europe was based on Christian values, although it wasn't primarily for protecting the Christian values. But at the same time, the great Christian democratic politicians created the principles of the new economic cooperation that started the process of European integration based on Christian values. Without this Christian approach, the European Union could not have started to take shape, which then united most of Europe.
By today, moral principles are lacking and financial notions are predominant. The founding fathers, one of the founding fathers, recently received the title Honorable from the Holy Seat. Is it by chance that Robert Schumann's name became identical with Christian democracy, regionalism? A Lotharingian person persecuted by the Nazis, who was primarily influenced by the thought of Pope Leo XIII, received this title not by chance. We can regain Europe only if we are able to formulate long-term visions, even only if we understand what it means to live in a dictatorship, who recognize the values in cultural cooperation, who understand that beyond the Christian values there is no organizing power. I believe that we are these people. Thank you.